Hello and welcome to part 2 of a thing where I talk about stuff I did. This is a two-part. Last time I talked about, it's the Jackaboy animation. Last time I talked about the lighting and the running tunnel with the whooshy whoosh. This time it's gonna be how I animated the low poly fire, how I did the upside down dangly legs bit, and also the anti-bits. There's gonna be a bit of animation, a bit of deformers and rigging, and there's gonna be a bit of shader stuff. And then just a few bits of Premiere and also After Effects. So this is part 2. Part 1 is probably in the description if you want to watch that and haven't. Let's go already!
So this is the fire scene. Now it's very simplistic. It's very simple setup I've got going here. And I'm gonna just go through what I did to create this, because once we have this shot ready and good to go with animation, all we need to do is then import it into the scene that is relevant for the fire, which is the rooftop interior scene, which, now that I say it out loud, doesn't make sense. It's not a rooftop when it's interior, but we did need fire regardless. So this is how I did it. First of all, I just modeled sort of a teardrop shape to get a fire base going, and then I flattened out the bottom. You can see the topology isn't very structured at all. Then again, this kind of works out for fire, because fire is organic and is supposed to be random. So all I did was make a teardrop shape, flatten out the bottom, and then I triangulated it by going into here and hitting triangulate, which just makes things into triangles, which is something I usually do with my models, because I like just the look of a triangulated surface. When the light and reflections hit it, it looks kind of cool. But anyway, having that teardrop shape, I went ahead and I added a couple of deformers to it, which is up here under rigging for some reason, and then deform, and you have all these non-linear deformers right here. Bend, flare, sign, squash, twist, wave. Sounds like a dance, doesn't it? Bend it, flare it, sign it, squash it, twist it, wave it, pop it, pull it. But I didn't use all of them. I used a sine wave, first of all, to start things off. Nice and easy, with a nice little sine 1, appropriately named right there. You can see that the sine wave, all this does is make the fire undulate slightly, boogie woogie back and forth, like that. I did change the low bound, because I didn't want the base to shift around too much. So as you can see, this is doing that. If the low bound was at -1, it would shift the whole thing way too much, which I didn't want. Next up was a twist deformer, and all this does is, you know, twist the fire around to make it a bit more random and a bit more alive. And a flare deformer that does sort of a wibble wobble. I don't know what would you call it? Shut up, leave me alone. It just makes it grow and shrink a bit to give it a more sporadic and random shape to it. I'm gonna show you how I keyed all this in just a moment, but the last thing I did was add another sign. This one is tighter, so it makes the surface more randomized. As you can see, if I turn it on and off, you can see that it just sort of adds a tighter ripple to the whole thing. If I offset it, you can see sort of what it does here. It just makes the whole thing wobble like that, which felt kind of fiery. So what I did with all of these deformers combined is I went in, and as you can see by the red here, they all have keyframes. And if I go into the keyframe curves, you can see that I added just some random keyframes for these deformers, and I made sure that all of them had a different sort of offset. So this flare 1, for example, I have these keyframes that go. This one goes only to keyframe number, what is this, frame 18, and while this one goes all the way over to 35, and then this one is all the way over here to frame 100 probably, because I like even numbers, because that makes it, when it loops over time, that makes it offset more and more, because if one animation finishes and starts looping over faster than another, then they are gonna offset each other more and more as time goes on. So what I did when I had these randomized animations that I just, you know, keyed and tweaked to my liking, you just select them all and then go into curves, post infinity, cycle. And what that means, it's just gonna cycle. It's just gonna reuse, when the curves finish, whatever frame they finish on, it's gonna start over and just do the whole thing again. So for making things like fire, or things that have a continuous motion, this is very useful. It's the same technique I used to make the tail. For example, in the cry animation, in the ghost cry scene, I just added this sort of animation to the tail joints that let me freely animate the rest of the body independently, but the tail would always stay wiggling. And there are other options. You can cycle with offset, you can oscillate, which means it goes back and forth, but that kind of, it's easier to tell when it's going forwards and then backwards, because it's the exact same motion but backwards, which is usually very easy to pick up on. Just try to reversing any footage and you can just tell that it's usually reversed and then going back and forth. It's useful. Say if you wanted to animate a clock and you had a grandfather clock, but you only felt like animating the pendulum one way, and then you got really bored, you could just select all the curves and select oscillate and it'll go back and forth. Boom, useful. But for fire, this is how I did it. And if you play it out, you can see it's just doing that. It's just doing its thing. And then this whole scene I just imported into the actual animation. And here it is, the set for the actual bit of the animation. So as you can see, the fires are just dancing along, and what I did to get the offset so they weren't, so they didn't look like copies of the exact same fire doing the exact same thing. You can see these two, this one over here, and then this one over here. They are moving exactly the same way. You can see they go up and down in the same at the same pace. They have a different rotation, but they go up and down, they're in sync. Which didn't matter because you start on this and then you pan over here, so you never see the both of them in the same shot. But for these fires, I had to offset the frames. So if I go in here and open up the curves editor again, you can see that this is the start here of the curves, but for this one, they're offset, and for this one, they're offset. So all I did was go in here and, you know, just move them around in time to get just a different offset. And offset the entire animation. I didn't keyframe individual animations for all these flames, I just offset the existing one. So that was a quick and easy way to get multiple fires acting differently without having to redo the whole thing over again. So the fire shader here is a shader, a normal Redshift architectural shader, which is the base shader for Redshift. It's the shader I use for pretty much anything, if it's not a subsurface scattering shader or a luminescent shader like a light source, because then you would use the incandescent shader. But for this shader, I wanted you to still be able to see the polygons. I wanted it to look like a shape and not just a silhouette of a flame, which is what it would look like if I used an incandescent shader. So what I did here is I used a normal shader with a ramp that just went from red to orange or to yellow to give it that nice fiery look. And as you can see in the preview here, it's got this weird outline. What that is a rim light shader, or a rim light ramp rather. So you can see on the incandescents here, I have a special shader, a blend shader, which is using the red color from the ramp, the original red here, just bumped up a bit because I wanted it to have a nice glow to it. This is what is making the fire glow a bit. It is incandescent, but it's not an incandescent shader. So it is giving off some light, but not pure light. It's still susceptible to reflections and shadows and stuff like that, which isn't a thing that fire usually is in real life, but again, I wanted it to look cool. So that's the base for this blend shader, but I also have another ramp. This is just a light ramp to darkness, and this is what's causing the rim light, the ring you can see around this shader example here. And all this really does, let me go into the camera actually and turn off the depth of field so we can see this easier. All this really does is give the flames a brighter edge. Anything that's facing away from the camera gets a brighter edge. This is what you would use on, this is if you've ever played Super Mario Galaxy, and you can see that Mario has this bright edge to him all the time that makes him really stand out from the background. It's the same principle. You add a rim light into the shader. As you can see here, all the faces that are at an angle from the camera get this sort of brighter shade to them that makes them really pop out, and it gives it a bit of a more alive feeling, because as the flames turn and the faces, the polygons, they change their angle and their shape towards the camera, this is gonna fade in and out and go away and show up on other polygons, and it just gives it more life to the whole shape of the fire as a whole, rather than just having this ramp of orange to yellow. Another thing people wanted me to talk about is the anti-shots and how I incorporated him into the animation, and it's very basic, very simple actually. He's there the whole time. You can see when Jackboy Man is stuck in the roof and he falls down, Anti is here and he's doing his thing, and he shows up there, and then he's over here as Jackboy Man enters frame, and he's actually there the entire time. But what I did was, much like the running shot where I rendered the logo and Jackboy Man on a separate layer, here I rendered Anti on a separate layer. So as we come into this shot, Anti is there, and the camera pans over, and he's still there, and he's still there, and then Jackboy Man comes in, and now we can only see his shadow that he is casting by intersecting with Anti. But what I did with that then is took the frames into Premiere and did my normal Anti treatment on that with the filters and the glitching and just the general normal Anti stuff to get that same look. So as you can see here, the camera movement is the same because it's the frames we rendered from Maya, but he's coming in here, he's doing this thing, and then he's glitching out, and then he disappears. And this is when, in After Effects, Jackboy Man takes over. So all I did was add that in from Premiere. I rendered that out with another alpha channel and added that back onto this animation, and used a couple of different blend modes: screen, normal, light and add, color burn, exclusion, hue, just to give it a more glitchy random look. And then as he glitches out, Jack takes over. So that is how I did those shots, and then I glitched him back in again a bit later, and so on for the following bits where he appears. And lastly, I just wanted to mention this scene very briefly, the Dangle Scene, because it required some special treatment. For a very short and simple shot, I had to reverse the entire rig for Jackboy Man, because usually he is rooted around, you know, his pelvis, and anything that goes up can rotate around that, so he can turn his head, turn his torso, turn his legs. But for this shot, I needed everything to rotate around his neck and down to make this sort of animation possible. So what I had to do was re-rig the entire model to be based around the head rather than the pelvis. And as you can see here, his head is stationary while the body is doing that. So what I did to do that is just re-rig the entire model, and I now have a special scene where Jackboy Man, rather than being able to bend from the hips up, he can only bend from the head, and the head will always remain. Not sure if I ever need to use this again, but it made for good dangles, and you can also make him dance.
And there you have it, a couple of things. Some fires, some dangles, some anti-bits, and the other video, I forgot what's in that already, but those things are there as well. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If you did, that's a good thing. If you didn't, well, I mean, I can't help that you're. Thank you for watching. Whatever's next, I have no idea. Go watch my games. You want? All right. Farewell.